It was in the year 1895 that Sherlock Holmes and I found ourselves in one of England's great university towns. We had been there for several weeks, while Holmes conducted some research into early English customs. My friend has often mentioned that he only values knowledge that is likely to prove useful in his deductions. To my knowledge, however, he was not engaged in any cases, so the exact reason for this research was unclear to me. He discovered some very interesting information about Anglo-Saxon landowners during our time away from London. In fact, over the years, Holmes has collected some very remarkable facts on all sorts of subjects, which I think could one day be the subject of a book or two. These would be historical rather than detective. I shall not give any clue as to the identity of the town, as it would be unfair on the people concerned in the incident that occurred during our stay. Holmes is noted for his discretion, which is why so many clients come to consult him. Since I agreed to keep the details of the case vague, Holmes was happy for the story to be published, especially since, as he said, it would be informative, and there was little opportunity for me to romanticize it. We were staying in lodgings close to the library where Holmes was doing his research. Although the area was pleasant, Holmes disliked being away from his home in London. We were not far from the river, with pleasant walks along the banks, but Holmes never walked for the sake of it when he was investigating a case. He was single-minded in his pursuit of the solution, and any travel, whether on foot or by other transport, always had a reason and a destination. One evening we had a visit from an acquaintance of ours, Mr. Hilton Soames, a tutor and lecturer at the College of St. Luke's. I first met Mr. Soames when I was at grammar school. He was an old colleague of my Latin master, Mr. Martin, who invited him to visit our school and give a talk to the students. By chance, he and my father met and became quite good friends, so I got to know him well. He had even provided us with help several years before, when I asked him to assist us with a case that involved an old Greek manuscript. It was then that he had met Holmes, although I do not recall them becoming especially close friends. Mr. Soames was a tall, rather thin man of a nervous and excitable temperament. I had always known him to be restless in his manner, but on this particular occasion he was in such a state of uncontrollable agitation that it was clear something very unusual had happened. We barely had time to greet him before his words came tumbling out in a rush.
"I trust, Mr. Holmes, that you can spare me a few hours of your valuable time. We have had a very painful incident at St. Luke's, and really, if it wasn't for the happy chance of your being in town, I should not have known what to do."
He stood wringing his hands and looking at Holmes earnestly. By contrast, Holmes stared back at him calmly, with that bland, emotionless expression that I knew so well on his face. He had little patience with nervousness and agitation, and considered it wasted energy. "I am very busy just now, and I want no distractions," he answered, in his usual direct manner. "I would much prefer that you called the police." Soames's face fell.
"No, no, my dear sir, that would be utterly impossible. Once the law is involved, it cannot be turned away. This is just one of those cases where, for the credit of the college, it is most essential to avoid scandal. Your discretion is as well known as your powers, and you are the one man in the world who can help me. I beg you, Mr. Holmes, to do what you can."
My friend's temper had not improved since he had been deprived of the pleasant and familiar surroundings of Baker Street. Without his scrapbook, his chemicals, and his homely untidiness, he was an uncomfortable man. He shrugged his shoulders in a manner that showed that he was prepared to listen, although reluctantly. "Then be seated, Mr. Soames, and try to calm yourself." Soames perched on the edge of the chair, ill at ease. Then, in hurried words, and with many excited gestures, he began his story.
"I must explain to you, Mr. Holmes, that tomorrow is the first day of the examination for the Fortescue Scholarship. I am one of the examiners. If you remember, my subject is Greek, and the first of the papers consists of a large passage of translation which the candidates have not seen. This passage is printed on the examination paper, and it would naturally be a great advantage if the candidate could prepare it in advance. For this reason, great care is taken to keep the paper secret."
During this time, Holmes sat back in his chair, his eyes staring vacantly into space. I knew this was a common habit of his when he was thinking, and I was sure that he was absorbing the professor's story, but it was understandable that it might appear to Soames that his mind was elsewhere. He stared at Holmes, and his narrative faltered. I nodded encouragingly, and Soames continued.
Today at about 3 o'clock the proofs of this paper arrived from the printers. The exercise consists of half a chapter of Thucydides, the Greek historian and philosopher. I had to read it over carefully, as the text must be absolutely correct. At 4:30 my task was not yet completed. I had, however, promised to take tea in a friend's rooms, so I left the papers on my desk. I was away a little more than an hour. You are aware, Mr. Holmes, that in our college many rooms have 2 sets of doors, one on the inside and a heavy oak one on the outside. As I approached my outer door on my return, I was amazed to see a key in it. For an instant I imagined that I had left my own key in the lock, but on feeling in my pocket I found that mine was there. The only duplicate that existed, as far as I knew, was the one that belonged to my servant Bannister, a man who has looked after my rooms for 10 years, and whose honesty is absolutely above suspicion. On questioning Bannister, I found that the key was indeed his, and that he had entered my room to ask if I wanted tea, and that he had very carelessly left the key in the door when he came out. His visit to my room must have been within minutes of my leaving it. His forgetfulness about the key would not have mattered on any other occasion, but on this one day it has resulted in the most dreadful consequences.
I could see that Holmes now had his full attention on Soames's words, as did I, for we both had an inkling of what was to come.
The moment I looked at my table,
went on Soames, glancing up at Holmes,
I became aware that someone had been rummaging among the papers. The examination papers from the printers were in 3 sheets. I had left them all together. Now I found that one of them was lying on the floor, one was on the side table near the window, and the third was where I had left it.
Holmes stared for the first time. So page number 1 was on the floor, number 2 was by the window, and number 3 where you left it, he said.
Exactly, Mr. Holmes. You amaze me. How could you possibly know that they were in that order?
A smile touched the corners of Holmes's mouth. Please continue with your very interesting statement, he said.
For an instant I imagined that Bannister had looked at the papers. That would have been unforgivable. He earnestly denied it, however, and I am sure that he was speaking the truth. The only other thing that could have happened was that someone passing had noticed the key in the door, had known that I was out, and had entered to look at the papers. A large sum of money is at stake, for the scholarship is a very valuable one. A dishonest person might well be prepared to run the risk to gain advantage over the other students.
Soames's face drooped, and his voice had almost become a whisper. Both Holmes and I nodded encouragement to him. He cleared his throat and continued.
Bannister was very upset by the incident. He nearly fainted when he found out that the papers had been meddled with. I gave him a little brandy and left him collapsed in a chair while I made a most careful examination of the room. I soon saw that the intruder had left other traces of his presence besides the rumpled papers. On the table in the window were several shreds from a pencil that had been sharpened. A broken tip of lead was lying there also. Evidently the rascal had copied the paper in a great hurry, had broken his pencil, and had been forced to put a fresh point on it.
Excellent, said Holmes, who was recovering his good humour as his attention became more engrossed in the case. Fortune has been your friend.
This was not all,
said Soames.
I have a new writing table with a fine surface of red leather. I am prepared to swear, and so is Bannister, that it was smooth and unstained. Now I found a clean cut in it, about 3 inches long, not a mere scratch, but a definite cut. Not only that, but on the table I found a small ball of black dough or clay, with specks of something that looked like sawdust in it. I am convinced that these marks were left by the man who rifled through the papers. There were no footmarks and no other evidence to his identity. I was at my wits' end, when suddenly the happy thought occurred to me that you were in town, and I came straight round to ask for your advice on the matter."
He looked earnestly at my friend.
"Do help me, Mr. Holmes. You see my dilemma. Either I must find the man, or else the examination must be postponed until fresh papers are prepared. Since this cannot be done without explanation, a hideous scandal will follow, which will throw a cloud not only on the college, but on the university. Above all, I wish to settle the matter quietly and discreetly."
"I shall be happy to look into it, and give you such advice as I can," said Holmes, rising and putting on his overcoat. "The case is not entirely without interest. Had anyone visited you in your room after the papers came to you?"
"Yes. Young Dowlett Raz, a student who lives on the same staircase, came in to ask some questions about the examination."
"For which he was entered?"
"Yes."
"And the papers were on your table?"
"To the best of my belief, they were rolled up."
"But might be recognized as what they were?"
"Possibly."
"No one else in your room?"
"No."
"Did anyone know that these papers would be there?"
"No one except the printer."
"Did this man Bannister know?"
"No, certainly not. No one knew."
"Where is Bannister now?"
"He was very ill, poor fellow. I left him collapsed in the chair. I was in such a hurry to come to you."
"You left your door open?"
"I locked up the papers first."
"Then it amounts to this, Mr. Soames. Unless Mr. Raz recognized the roll as being the papers, the man who tampered with them came upon them accidentally, without knowing that they were there."
"So it seems to me."
Holmes gave a mysterious smile. "Well," he said, "let us go to your rooms where this incident occurred. Not a case that would suit you, Watson. This one is mental, not physical." I felt a sudden anger that he should dismiss me like that. After all, I had helped him on such cases before. I may not have his mental agility, but he had always seemed to value my assistance. I looked up at him with a frown on my face and an argument on my lips, but saw that he was watching my reaction, smiling with delight at his joke. "Oh, all right. Come if you want to," he said. I returned his grin and reached for my coat. "Now, Mr. Soames, we are ready to help you." The college was not far, so we walked. I thought that the fresh air would certainly do Holmes good after all the hours he had spent cooped up in the library. I could also admire the exquisite architecture as we passed, although Holmes had other things on his mind, and walked with his head bowed. It was already twilight when we entered the ancient moss-covered courtyard of the old college. Our client's rooms were on the ground floor, with a latticed window looking out into the courtyard. Above were 3 students' rooms, one on each story. Holmes approached Soames's window, and, standing on tiptoe, with his neck craned, looked into the room.
"He must have entered through the door. There is no opening except the one pane,"
said Soames. "Dear me," said Holmes, and smiled in a strange way as he glanced at our companion. "Well, if there is nothing to be learned here, we had best go inside." A Gothic-arched door led to a worn stone staircase leading up to the students' rooms. Soames's door was just to the left. He unlocked the door and waved his hand to usher us in ahead of him, but instead we stood at the entrance while Holmes insisted on making an examination of the carpet. I knew his methods, but I could hear Soames just behind me, his breaths coming in short, impatient bursts at Holmes's apparent slowness. Holmes stood up and sighed. "I'm afraid there are no signs here. One could hardly hope for any on such a dry day. Your servant seems to have quite recovered, since he is no longer here. You left him in a chair, you say. Which chair?"
"By the window there."
"I see, near this little table. You can come in now. I have finished with the carpet. Let us take the little table first. Of course, what has happened is very clear. The man entered the room and took the papers sheet by sheet from the centre table. He carried them over to the window table, Mr. Soames, because from there he could see if you came across the courtyard, and so could make his escape."
"As a matter of fact, he could not,"
said Soames,
"because I entered by the side door."
"Ah, that's good. Well, anyway, that was in his mind. Let me see the 3 sheets. No finger impressions?" No. Well, he carried this one over first, and he copied it. How long would it take him to do that, using every possible abbreviation? A quarter of an hour, not less. Then he tossed it down and seized the next. He was in the midst of that when your return caused him to make a very hasty escape. Very hurried, since he had not time to replace the papers, which would tell you that someone had been there. You were not aware of any hurrying feet on the stairs as you entered the outer door?
No, I can't say I was.
Well, he wrote so furiously that he broke his pencil and had to sharpen it again, as you see. He looked up at me. This is of interest, Watson. The pencil was not an ordinary one. It was bigger than the usual size, with a soft lead. The outer colour was dark blue, the maker's name was printed in silver lettering, and the piece remaining was only about 1.5 inches long. Look for such a pencil, Mr. Soames, and you have got your man. When I add that he possesses a very long and very blunt knife with which to sharpen his pencil, you have an extra clue. Mr. Soames was somewhat overwhelmed by this flood of information. He just stared at Holmes for a few minutes, and then said,
I can follow the other points, but really, in this matter of the length of the pencil...
Holmes held out a small chip of wood shaving with the letters N.N. and a space of clear wood after them. You see?
No, I fear that even now...
Holmes sighed, trying not to show his impatience. I thought that Soames had been wise to leave everything as it was, including the pencil shavings. He was a man of intellect, but we are not all blessed with Holmes's sharp deductive powers. It was not easy to make the leaps of logic that came naturally to my detective friend. Holmes turned to me again. Watson, what do you think this N.N. could be? I was about to open my mouth to respond, when Holmes continued. It is at the end of a word. You are aware that Johann Faber is the most common maker's name. Isn't it clear that there is just as much of the pencil left as usually follows the Johann? I had to agree that he was correct. He held the table sideways to the electric light. I was hoping that the paper on which he wrote was thin, and some trace of it might come through onto this polished surface. No, I see nothing. I don't think there is anything more to be learned here. Now for the central table. This small pellet is, I presume, the black doughy mass you spoke of. Roughly a pyramid in shape, and hollowed out, I see. As you say, there appears to be grains of sawdust in it. Dear me, this is very interesting. And the cut, a tear. It begins with a thin scratch and ends in a jagged hole. I am grateful to you for drawing my attention to this case, Mr. Soames. Where does that door lead to?
To my bedroom.
Have you been in there since your adventure?
No, I came straight away for you.
I would like to have a glance round. He walked towards the room in question and stopped in the doorway. What a charming, old-fashioned room. Once again Soames made to follow him, only to be stopped by Holmes's outstretched hand. Perhaps you will kindly wait a minute until I have examined the floor. No, I see nothing. What about this curtain? He walked towards it. You hang your clothes behind it. If anyone were forced to hide in this room, he must do it here, since the bed is too low and the wardrobe too shallow. No one there, I suppose? I was beside Holmes as he reached for the curtain. He seemed to stiffen, and I caught a look of sudden alertness in his eyes, showing that he was prepared for an emergency. He grasped the curtain, and with a swift wrench drew it back. Both Soames and I jumped a little, not knowing what or who to expect. As it happened, the opened curtain showed nothing but 3 or 4 suits of clothes hanging from a line of pegs. I sighed with relief, and my heart resumed its normal rhythm. I could see the question on Soames's mind, but he was wise not to utter it. Holmes turned away, and suddenly stooped to the floor. "Hello, what's this?" he said. It was a small pyramid of black putty-like stuff, exactly like the one on the table in the study. Holmes held it out in his open palm in the glare of the electric light. "Your visitor seems to have left traces in your bedroom as well as your sitting-room, Mr. Soames."
What could he have wanted there?
I think it is clear enough. You came back by an unexpected way, and so he had no warning until you were at the very door. What could he do? He grabbed everything that could betray him and rushed into your bedroom to hide."
"Good gracious, Mr. Holmes! Do you mean to tell me that all the time I was talking to Bannister in the sitting-room, we had the man prisoner and didn't know it?"
"That's how I see it."
"Surely there is another alternative, Mr. Holmes. I don't know whether you noticed my bedroom window."
"Lattice-paned, lead framework, 3 separate windows, one swinging on its hinge and large enough to allow a man to enter." I smiled at his accurate and detailed description. Although Holmes's highly developed eye for detail enabled him to solve crimes, there were times when he just liked to impress his client.
"Exactly,"
said Soames.
"and it looks out on an angle of the courtyard that makes it partly invisible. The man could have entered here, left traces as he passed through the bedroom, and finally, finding the door open, have escaped that way."
Holmes shook his head impatiently. "Let us be practical," he said. "I understand you to say that there are 3 students who use this stairway and are in the habit of passing your door."
"Yes, there are."
"And they are all going in for this examination?"
"Yes."
"Have you any reason to suspect any one of them more than the others?" Soames hesitated.
"It is a very delicate question,"
he said.
"I hardly like to throw suspicion when there is no proof."
"Let us hear the suspicions," said Holmes. "I will look after the proof."
"I will tell you then, in a few words, the characters of the 3 men who live in these rooms."
Holmes nodded.
"The lower of the 3 is Gilchrist, who is a fine scholar and athlete. He plays in both the rugby team and the cricket team for the college. He got his Blue Awards for outstanding achievement in hurdles and long jump. He is a fine, manly fellow. His father was the notorious Sir Jabez Gilchrist, who lost all his money gambling on horse racing. My student has therefore been left very poor, but he is hard-working and industrious. He will do well. The second floor is inhabited by Dowlett Ras, an Indian man. He is a quiet, mysterious type. His work is well up to standard, although Greek is one of his weaker subjects. He is steady and methodical, though."
Holmes nodded again, and we waited to hear about the 3rd student.
"The top-floor room belongs to Miles McLaren," continued Soames. "He is a brilliant fellow when he chooses to work, one of the brightest and most promising students in the university. Unfortunately, he is strong-willed and wastes his time as well as his talents. He is rebellious and cares only about himself. He was nearly expelled in his first year for cheating at cards. He has been slacking all this term, so he must be dreading the examination."
"Then it is he whom you suspect," said Holmes.
"I dare not go so far as that, but of the 3, he is perhaps the most likely."
"Exactly. Now, Mr. Soames, let me talk to your servant Bannister." We moved back into the study, and Soames rang the bell. Soon there was a light tap on the door, and a man entered. He was a little, white-faced man, clean-shaven and with grey hair. I would have put his age at around 50. His plump face was twitching with nervousness, and his fingers could not keep still. Evidently he was still suffering from the sudden disturbance to the quiet routine of his life.
"We are investigating this unhappy business, Bannister,"
said Soames.
"Yes, sir."
"I understand," said Holmes, "that you left your key in the door."
"Yes, sir,"
he said, turning to Holmes, yet not quite looking him in the eye. His eyelids also reflected his nervousness, fluttering wildly. "Wasn't it very extraordinary that you should do this on the very day that these important papers were inside?"
"It was most unfortunate, sir, but I have occasionally done the same thing at other times."
"What time was it when you entered the room?"
"It was about 4:30. That is Mr. Soames's tea time."
"How long did you stay?"
"When I saw that he wasn't there, I left at once."
"Did you look at these papers on the table?"
"No, sir, certainly not."
"How did you come to leave the key in the door?"
"I had the tea tray in my hand. I thought I would come back for the key, then I forgot."
"Then it was open all the time?"
"Yes, sir."
"So anyone in the room could get out?"
"Yes, sir."
When Mr. Soames returned and called for you, were you very upset?
Yes, sir. Such a thing has never happened during the many years that I have been here. I nearly fainted, sir.
So I understand. Where were you when you began to feel bad?
Where was I, sir? Why, here, near the door.
That is strange, because you sat down in that chair over there in the corner. Why did you pass these other chairs?
I don't know, sir. It didn't matter to me where I sat.
Soames stirred, and I could see that he felt pity for his employee's discomfort.
I really don't think he knew much about it, Mr. Holmes, he said. He was looking very bad, quite ghastly.
Holmes seemed to ignore the interruption, and still addressed Bannister. You stayed here when the professor left?
Only for a minute or two. Then I locked the door and went to my room.
Whom do you suspect?
Oh, I would not like to say, sir. I don't believe there is any gentleman in this university who is capable of cheating in such a way. No, sir, I do not believe it.
Thank you, that will do, said Holmes. Oh, one more word. You have not mentioned any of this to the three gentlemen on this stairway?
No, sir, not a word.
You haven't seen any of them?
No, sir.
Very good. Holmes turned to Soames. Now, Mr. Soames, we shall take a walk in the grounds, if you please. Bannister left, and the three of us stepped outside. 3 yellow squares of light shone above us in the gathering gloom. Your 3 birds are all in their nests, said Holmes, looking up. Hello, what's that? One of them seems restless. It was the student on the 2nd floor, whose dark silhouette appeared suddenly against the window blind. He was pacing swiftly up and down his room. I should like to see each of them, said Holmes. Is it possible?
No difficulty in the world, answered Soames. This set of rooms is the oldest in the college, and it is not unusual for visitors to look over them. Come along, and I will show you personally.
We stepped back inside and went up 1 flight of stairs. No names, please, said Holmes, as we knocked at Gilchrist's door. A tall, fair-haired, slim young fellow opened it and made us welcome. He accepted that our reason for the visit was, as usual, to study the really curious pieces of medieval architecture in the room. Holmes seemed to be so charmed by one of them that he insisted on drawing it in his notebook. While doing so, he broke his pencil and had to borrow one from Gilchrist, and then borrowed a knife to sharpen his own. I could guess what he was up to, and my suspicion was confirmed when the same curious incident occurred in Dowlett Rass's room. He was small in stature, rather silent, and looked at us suspiciously, no doubt glad when Holmes's architectural studies came to an end. Only at the 3rd visit did our ruse fail to work. In fact, we were not to be admitted at all. The door would not open to our knock, and was answered by a torrent of bad language. I don't care who you are not coming in, roared the angry voice. Tomorrow is the exam, and I won't be disturbed by anyone.
A rude fellow,
said Soames, flushing with anger as we went back downstairs.
Of course, he did not know it was I who was knocking, but nonetheless his conduct was very impolite, and indeed, under the circumstances, rather suspicious.
Holmes' response was a curious one. Can you tell me his exact height? He asked.
Really, Mr. Holmes, I cannot say. He is taller than Ras, but not as tall as Gilchrist. I suppose 5'6" would be about right.
That is very important, said Holmes. And now, Mr. Soames, I wish you good night. Soames cried aloud in astonishment and dismay.
Good gracious, Mr. Holmes, you are surely not going to leave me in this abrupt fashion. You don't seem to realize the position. Tomorrow is the examination. I must take some definite action tonight. I cannot allow the examination to be held if one of the papers has been tampered with. The situation must be faced.
Mr. Soames, said Holmes abruptly, cutting him off mid-sentence, you must leave everything as it is. I shall drop round early tomorrow morning and talk the matter over with you. It is possible that I may then be in a position to know what course of action to take. Meanwhile, you must change nothing at all.
Very good, Mr. Holmes,
said Soames resignedly. The worried expression had reappeared on his downcast face. You can be perfectly easy in your mind. We shall certainly find some way out of your difficulties. I will take the black clay with me, and also the pencil cuttings. Goodbye. When we were out in the darkness of the college grounds, we again looked up at the windows. Dowlett Ross still paced his room. The others were not visible. "Well, Watson, what do you think of it?" Holmes asked, as we came out into the main street. "Quite a little parlour game, a sort of 3-card trick, is it not? There are 3 men. It must be one of them. You take your choice. Which is it?"
"The foul-mouthed fellow at the top," I said. "He is the one with the worst record, and yet the Indian man is a curious fellow also. Why should he be pacing his room all the time?"
"There is nothing in that. He is sitting an exam tomorrow. Most men pace when they are learning anything by heart."
He looked at us in a strange way.
"So would you, if a flock of strangers came in on you when you were preparing for an examination the next day, and every moment was of value. No, I see nothing in that. Pencils, too, and knives, all was satisfactory. But that fellow does puzzle me."
"Who?"
"Why, Bannister, the servant. What's his game in the matter?"
"He impressed me as being a perfectly honest man."
"Me too. That's the puzzling part. Why should a perfectly honest man—" "Well, well, here's a large stationer's. We shall begin our researches here."
There were only 4 stationery shops in the town, and at each Holmes produced his pencil chips and asked if they sold similar ones. All said that they could order one, but that it was an unusual size of pencil, so was rarely kept in stock. I expected Holmes to be disappointed at his failure, for finding a similar pencil in one of the shops may have led to the discovery of the owner of the original, but he just shrugged in half-humorous resignation.
"No good, my dear Watson. This, the best and only final clue, has come to nothing. I doubt that we can build up a sufficient case without it. By Jove! My dear fellow, it's nearly 9, and the landlady mentioned that a tasty dinner was to be served at 7:30. You are a bad lodger, Watson. With your irregularity at meals, I expect that you will soon be asked to leave. No doubt I shall share your downfall."
Again I was about to react at the unfairness, but he looked at me with that twinkle in his eye, and I smiled at his gentle teasing.
"Not, however," he went on, "before we have solved the problem of the nervous tutor, the careless servant, and the 3 enterprising students."
Far from throwing us out, our landlady had saved us some dinner without so much as a murmur of complaint. Such was the effect that Holmes could have on people. The case in hand was not mentioned again that evening, although Holmes sat lost in thought for a long time after our meal. At 8 in the morning, my friend came into my room just as I had washed and dressed.
"Well, Watson," he said, "it is time we went down to St. Luke's. Can you do without breakfast?"
"Certainly."
"Soames will be in a dreadful fidget until we are able to tell him something positive."
"Have you anything positive to tell him?"
"I think so."
"You have formed a conclusion?"
"Yes, my dear Watson, I have solved the mystery."
"But what fresh evidence have you got?"
"Aha! It is not for nothing that I got out of bed at the untimely hour of 6 o'clock. I have put in 2 hours of hard work, and covered at least 5 miles with something to show for it. Look at this."
He held out his hand. On his palm were 3 little pyramids of black doughy clay. "Why, Holmes, you had only 2 yesterday."
"And 1 more this morning. It is a fair guess that wherever number 3 came from, it is also the source of numbers 1 and 2, eh, Watson? Well, come along, and we shall ease poor Soames's concerns."
I put on my overcoat and hat and followed him out of the building towards the college. When we reached Soames's rooms, we found him in a state of pitiable agitation. He could hardly stand still, and ran towards Holmes with his hands outstretched eagerly, his face distraught. I could understand just how he must be feeling. In a few hours the examination would begin, and he was still in a dilemma between making the facts public and cancelling the exam, or allowing the culprit to compete for the valuable scholarship with an unfair advantage over his fellow students. Either event would result in bad publicity for both him and the college. Holmes was perfectly serene, however. He had unfailing confidence in his own ability to solve the problem, and expected others to have the same.
"Thank heaven you have come. I feared that you had given up in despair. What am I to do? Shall the examination proceed?"
"Yes, let it proceed by all means.
Holmes said calmly.
"But this rascal—"
"He shall not compete."
"You know who is behind this?"
"I think so." Soames visibly relaxed, and the lines of worry on his face smoothed. He sighed deeply, still staring earnestly into Holmes's face, awaiting the answer. Holmes continued, "If this matter is not to become public, we must give ourselves certain powers and create a small private court-martial. You sit over there, if you please, Soames. Watson, you here. I'll take the armchair in the middle. I think that we are now imposing enough to strike terror into a guilty heart. Kindly ring the bell." A moment after it was rung, Bannister entered and shrank back in surprise at our official-looking pose. "You will kindly close the door," said Holmes. "Now, Bannister, will you please tell us the truth about yesterday's incident?" The man turned white to the roots of his hair. He reached for the door-handle with a shaking hand, closing it with a little more force than was necessary. When he turned back to Holmes, he still could not look him in the eye.
"I have told you everything, sir."
His voice was almost a whisper. "Nothing to add?"
"Nothing at all, sir."
"Well, then, I must make some suggestions to you. When you sat down on that chair yesterday, did you do so in order to hide some object that would have shown who had been in the room?" Bannister's face was deathly pale.
"No, sir. Certainly not."
"It is only a suggestion," said Holmes graciously. "I frankly admit that I am unable to prove it, but it seems probable enough, since the moment that Mr. Soames' back was turned you released the man who was hiding in that bedroom." Bannister licked his dry lips.
"There was no man, sir."
"Ah, that's a pity, Bannister. Up to now you may have spoken the truth, but now I know that you have lied." The man's face set in sullen defiance. I could see that he knew he'd been found out, but was unwilling to admit it.
"There was no man, sir."
Come, Bannister."
"No, sir, there was no one."
"In that case," said Holmes, "you can give us no further information. Would you please remain in the room? Stand over there near the bedroom door. Now, Soames, would you be kind enough to go up to young Gilchrist's room and ask him to come down to your office?" An instant later, the tutor returned, bringing the student with him. He was a fine figure of a man, tall, lithe, and agile, with a springy step and a pleasant open face. His troubled blue eyes glanced at each of us, and finally rested with an expression of blank dismay upon Bannister in the farthest corner. "Just close the door," said Holmes. "Now, Mr. Gilchrist, we are all quite alone here, and no one need ever know one word of what passes between us. We can be perfectly frank with each other. We want to know, Mr. Gilchrist, how an honourable man like yourself came to commit such an action as that of yesterday." The unfortunate young man staggered back and cast a look full of horror and reproach at Bannister.
"No, Mr. Gilchrist, sir. I never said a word. Never one word,"
cried Bannister. "No, but you have now," said Holmes. "Now, sir, you must see that after Bannister's words your position is hopeless, and that your only chance lies in an honest confession." For a moment Gilchrist, with an upraised hand, tried to hide the many expressions twisting his face. The next, he had thrown himself on his knees beside the table, and, burying his face in his hands, burst into a storm of passionate sobbing. Come, said Holmes kindly. "It is human to make mistakes, and at least no one can accuse you of being a callous criminal. Perhaps it would be easier for you if I were to tell Mr. Soames what occurred, and you can correct me where I am wrong. Shall I do so? Well, don't trouble yourself to answer. Listen and see that I do you no injustice." Holmes leaned forward in his chair and turned to Soames. "Mr. Soames, from the moment you said to me that no one, not even Bannister, could have known that the papers were in your room, the case began to take a definite shape in my mind. The printer one could, of course, dismiss. He could examine the papers in his own office, so why break into yours? I also ruled out the Indian student. If the papers were in a roll, he could not possibly know what they were. On the other hand, it seemed an unthinkable coincidence that a man should dare to enter the room, and that by chance on that very day the papers were on the table. I dismissed that. The man who entered knew that the papers were there. How did he know? There was absolute silence in the room, except for the patter of the rain on the window as the question hung in the air. When we approached your room, continued Holmes, I examined the window from the outside. You amused me by supposing that I was thinking of the possibility of someone having forced his way through it in broad daylight, under the eyes of all these rooms opposite. Such an idea was absurd. What I was doing was measuring how tall a man would need to be in order to see what papers were on the central table as he passed by. I am 6 feet tall, and I could do it, but with an effort. No one less than that would have a chance. Already, you see, I had reason to think that if one of your 3 students was a man of unusual height, he was the most worth watching. I entered and explained to you my thoughts about the side table. I could make nothing of the centre table until, in your description of Gilchrist, you mentioned that he was a long-distance jumper. Then the whole thing came to me in an instant, and I only needed certain items to prove it, which I speedily obtained. Holmes looked at Soames and at Gilchrist, whose eyes were directed firmly at the floor. What happened was this. This young fellow had spent the afternoon at the athletic grounds, where he had been practising the long jump. He returned, carrying his jumping shoes, which have several sharp spikes on the soles. As he passed your window, he saw the papers upon your table, and he guessed what they were. No harm would have been done had it not been that, as he passed your door, he noticed the key that had been left in the lock by Bannister here. A sudden impulse came over him to enter and see if they were indeed the examination papers. It was not a dangerous exploit, for he could always pretend that he had simply called in to ask a question. Well, when he saw that they were the papers, it was then that he gave in to temptation. He put his shoes on the table. Holmes turned to Gilchrist. What was it you put on that chair by the window? Gilchrist still did not look any of us in the eye, especially Holmes. Gloves, he mumbled. Holmes looked triumphantly at Bannister. He put his gloves on the chair, and then he took the papers, sheet by sheet, to the window to copy them. He thought the tutor would return by the main gate, and then he would see him. As we know, Mr. Soames came in by the side gate. Suddenly, Gilchrist, you heard him at the door. There was no possible escape. You forgot your gloves, but grabbed your shoes and darted into the bedroom. Holmes pointed to the scratch in the red leather of the table. You see that the scratch on the table is slight at one side, but deepens in the direction of the bedroom door. That is enough to show us that the shoe had been drawn in that direction, and that the culprit had taken refuge there. The earth around one of the spikes was left on the table, and a second sample was loosened and fell in the bedroom. I may add that I walked out to the athletic ground this morning, where I saw the sticky black clay that is used in the jumping pit. I have brought a specimen of it, together with some of the fine sawdust that is spread over it to prevent the athlete from slipping. Have I told the truth, Mr. Gilchrist? The student stood up straight. Yes, sir. It is true, he said.
Good heavens! Have you nothing to add?
Cried Soames. Yes, sir, I have. I have a letter here, Mr. Soames, that I wrote to you in the middle of a restless night. It was before I knew that my crime had been found out, but I felt such guilt at what I had done that I could not bring myself to benefit from it. Here it is, sir. With trembling fingers, Gilchrist offered a crumpled sheet of paper to his tutor. Soames took it and spread it open on his knee so that Holmes and I could read the contents. Dear Mr. Soames, I have decided not to enter the examination. I have been offered a commission in the Rhodesian police, and I am going out to South Africa at once. With all good wishes, yours sincerely, James Gilchrist. Soames put the letter on his desk.
I am indeed pleased to hear that you did not intend to profit by your unfair advantage, he said. But why did you change your mind?
Gilchrist pointed to Bannister. There is the man who set me on the right path, he said. Bannister had been sitting bolt upright throughout our interview with Gilchrist, but now breathed a sigh of relief and sagged in his chair a little, as if a great weight had been lifted from his shoulders. "Come now, Bannister," said Holmes, turning to the servant. "It will be clear to you from what I have said that only you could have let this young man out, since you were left in the room and must have locked the door when you went out. As to his escaping by the window, it was unlikely. Can you please clear up the last point in this mystery, and tell us the reason for your action?"
"It was simple enough, sir, if you had known. But even with all your cleverness, it was impossible that you could know. I used to work for old Sir Jabez Gilchrist, this young gentleman's father, as his butler. When he was ruined and lost his fortune, I came to this college as a servant, but I never forgot my old employer. I watched his son and helped him all I could for the sake of the old days. When I came into this room yesterday, after the alarm was given, the first thing I saw was Mr. Gilchrist's tan gloves lying on that chair. I knew those gloves well, and I understood that if Mr. Soames saw them, the game was up. I flopped down into that chair, and nothing would budge me until Mr. Soames went for you. Then out came my poor young master, whom I had bounced on my knee as a baby, and confessed it all to me. Wasn't it natural, sir, that I should save him? Wasn't it also natural that I should try to speak to him as his dead father would have done, and make him understand that he could not profit by such cheating? Could you blame me, sir?"
This confession sent a wave of sympathy through me, and I pitied the man for the position he had found himself in. Bannister clearly felt a great sense of duty for both his employer and young Gilchrist, and the torture of having betrayed Soames was written clearly on his face. I looked over at Holmes, and thought I detected similar emotions in his keen gaze. "No, indeed," he said heartily, springing to his feet. I too rose and reached for my hat, satisfied at the outcome. Holmes shook hands with the Professor. "Well, Soames, I think we have cleared up your little problem. Now we must attend to another pressing engagement. Our breakfast awaits us." He turned to Gilchrist. "As to you, sir, I trust that a bright future awaits you in Rhodesia. In this instance, you have fallen from grace. Let us see in the future how high you can rise. Come, Watson." As we left, Soames unlocked a drawer in his desk and took out the examination papers, smoothing them out on the table. I glanced at the top page, but my Greek had never been a strong subject. I far preferred Latin. Sherlock Holmes, The Three Students, by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle. Adapted by Stephanie Baudet. Read by Richard Usher. To download Sherlock Holmes activities, please visit www.sweetcherrypublishing.com/resources.